Let's Talk with Keith Spera is underwritten by the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation.
Hello, I'm Keith Spera from NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune. Welcome to Let's Talk. My guest this week is a slim-cut white guy with glasses named Keith who honed his writing chops at the Times-Picayune in the early 2000s. And no, I am not interviewing myself. This other Keith went on to write for the Boston Globe and the New York Times. He's also a National Public Radio contributor and a best-selling author. His new book is Charlie Hustle: The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. He'll be signing copies at Octavia Books on April 8th. Keith O'Brien, welcome to Let's Talk.
Thanks for having me, Keith. I love that intro.
Like I said before we got on the air, it's like looking in a mirror. You know, in that time since we worked together in the early 2000s at the Picayune, you've written 4 books and had 2 kids. I've written 1 book and had 3 kids. So you are winning, I think.
I don't know. I think kids count for extra. I don't know what the tally is on that, but I think you might be winning.
Yeah, raising a child, I think, is the equivalent of writing like 6 books. So
yeah. So I think you're winning technically. Yeah, I'm gonna have to either crank out another kid or at least 3 more books. I don't know which I'm gonna do first.
Well, one you make money, one you don't. So think about that.
That's fair. Good point.
All right, so your 4 books. We just read the title of the latest one. Your other books were Outside Shot, Big Dreams, Hard Times, and One County's Quest for Basketball Greatness, Paradise Falls, The True Story of an Environmental Catastrophe, and Fly Girls, How 5 Daring Women Defied All Odds and Made Aviation History. So my first observation is you love long book titles.
Yeah, or my publisher does. I don't know which.
Well, it seems like you're attracted to stories that maybe folks don't know that story, so you want to give a little bit of the information in the title, I guess, to kind of draw them in and let them know why this is an important and an intriguing story.
I think, especially in today's world of media and world of publishing, giving a potential reader a little bit more background about your book or your narrative in a subtitle is helpful, I think, from a publisher's perspective. But, you know, one question I often get asked about those 4 books is, well, they're not really about the same thing, you know, what drew you to them? And for me, it's the same thing that ever drew me to stories, you know, when I was writing at the Times-Picayune or writing anywhere else. I'm always just interested in the human narrative, you know, the stories of people who in many cases have been forgotten or overlooked, and their quest to do something. I mean, that is the ultimate story, you know, that people care about. You know, real people on some kind of journey, on some kind of quest, and you know, if there is any kind of unifying theme in my books, I think that would be it. Yeah,
and you know, when you do a book like Fly Girls, which dealt with some of the female pioneers in the aviation industry in the 1920s and 30s, I mean, everybody knows Amelia Earhart, but really the list stops there, what the average person knows about women flyers of that era. You know, you bring to the table a journalist's skills more than a historian's skills. I mean, you're not a trained historian, you're a journalist. Do you think in some ways that's an advantage to come at it with that set of skills? Because, you know, as a journalist, you want to write a story that's narratively compelling, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's true. You know, I have an interesting background, and then I don't know what yours is, but I didn't go to journalism school. I was a history major in college, and it was only after college, as I was casting around trying to figure out what someone with a history degree does, that I found journalism almost by accident. So I think early in my career, it was a disadvantage not to have a journalism degree, you know, when I was trying to get those first jobs. But I think it helped me always because I never took a class on journalism. I was just bringing my curiosity to the table, which I think is what, a good storyteller should do. Bring your curiosity to the table, find the story, and then, with the books I'm writing here, this is narrative nonfiction. It's not, hopefully, boring textbook history.
And you're correct. I did not have a journalism degree either. I was a political science major going to law school when I found out that I could get free tickets to concerts if I reviewed them. And so here I am 30 years later. That's how it
Just
worked out.
another thing we have in common. Two slim white guys with glasses who have no degrees to do the job they're doing.
Named
Wonderful.
Keith. Yes, named Keith, who has no formal training to do what they do. Exactly. So Pete Rose, this new book. Obviously, a controversial figure, one of the greatest figures in the history of professional baseball. Had a huge, spectacular rise, spectacular fall. The story, I think, speaks to anyone, but for you, you grew up in Cincinnati, right? So there was kind of a particular attachment to the story for you?
Yeah, so I'm born and raised in Cincinnati. I was born on the west side of town, which was and still is in many ways a more blue-collar, working-class part of town, and then ultimately moved to the east side, which was a bit more middle class to upper class. And so I was born just a couple miles from where Pete grew up on the west side. He was also born and raised in Cincinnati, and we're roughly the same age. And I came up in the 1970s and 80s when Pete Rose wasn't just a local icon; he was a national hero. And so he was really in the background of my childhood, in the way that Drew Brees was in the background of many people's lives and childhood in New Orleans. He was just woven into the fabric of the city. And so, like any storyteller, you keep a list of ideas and things you want to explore, and maybe things that could be a book. And Pete Rose was just always on that list, because he was so important to the story of baseball. I mean, frankly, you simply cannot tell the story of baseball in the 20th century without telling the story of Pete Rose. And because of that rise and fall that you mentioned. I mean, Pete's story is, I think, a universal one, in the sense that it is really sort of a Greek tragedy that just happened to play out on an American baseball field. He wills himself to the top, with hard work, hustle, and a lot of lucky breaks. And then in the second half of his career, as he's peaking as a player, he truly is unraveling as a person off the field, and that's just a compelling human story.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you're just tuning in, my guest today is Keith O'Brien, the author of the new Pete Rose biography, Charlie Hustle. Now, this is not an authorized biography, but Pete did grant you some time, and you did interview Pete as well as dozens of other people that were in his orbit over the years. How did you first approach Pete himself about this book project? I mean, what was your pitch to him to get him to participate to some degree?
So I ultimately got an introduction to Pete Rose through Cincinnati connections, and that was one thing I had going for me here. I'm from Cincinnati. I know that city. I know his story. I know his neighborhood. And so my earliest interviews were with people in Cincinnati who I knew were still close with Pete. And my pitch initially to them was, if there's a time for reckoning about Pete Rose's complicated, complex, controversial legacy, it is now. He will be 83 years old this April. And so, my pitch to them initially is, I want to tell the full story here, the full story of his rise and fall. And I wanted to talk to Pete about it, because I believed that if Pete, reckoned with it, truly reckoned with it, that people would have possibly a better understanding for what happened. And so, that was my initial pitch. That was what ultimately got me an introduction to Pete Rose. And when I did, he was ready to talk. And we did do about 27 hours of recorded interviews, some on the phone. And ultimately, I went to Las Vegas, where Pete Rose lives, and did 3 days of interviews on the ground there, and things were going well.
That sounds like a setup. That sounds like a setup for a twist.
Yeah,
things were going well, but
things were going well. I had no reason to believe that anything would change, and then suddenly it did, and for reasons that I still don't truly know, Pete stopped calling me back, and again, I don't know what happened. We didn't have a falling out. We didn't have an argument. But I think ultimately what happened is I was pushing Pete. I was asking him tough questions. Mm-hmm. And I will say, Pete told me things and talked about things that he's never spoken about before. But I think I pushed him as far as he could go.
Well, and like you said, I mean, he's in his 80s now. I mean, at a certain point, I'm sure he was just like, why am I dealing with this kid? Why am I dealing with this anymore? He just didn't want to deal with it anymore, probably. Did you find him, you found him to be open, it sounds like. He was comfortable talking to a point.
He was. Pete has, written in the past through ghostwriters about his gambling, which is ultimately what got him banned from baseball in 1989, 35 years ago, and cast him out into the hinterlands of his sport. But, like many memoirs, Pete's memoirs are thin on details at times, and a little thin ultimately on the darkness here. And that's really what I was trying to get Pete to do, was open up about the darkness, because let's just be honest, he knew the ramifications of gambling on baseball and placing wagers on his own team. He knew the rules, that if he was caught for that, he would be banned for life. It was printed on signs in every Major League Baseball clubhouse in America. He would have had to walk past that sign every day, multiple times a day. He knew. And so, what I really wanted to do was understand why. Why would he do it?
Yeah.
And, we talked a lot about that. And ultimately, Pete's answer, at the end of the day about why he would still do that, place bets on his own team, knowing that if he were caught, he would be cast out forever, was that simply he didn't think he would get caught. And, to me, that's a simple sort of childish answer, and yet I think it's really deep too. Pete succeeded as a baseball player and ultimately became the all-time hit leader because he always believed he would prevail. It didn't matter if there were 2 strikes and 2 outs in the bottom of the 9th and the team was down by 3. He believed that he could get a hit, steal second, make madness happen, and the Reds would come back. And that was real. But that same belief that he would always prevail, that same belief that if he was strong and tough and hustled, that he could not go down, was ultimately what made him fall off the field as a person, that same quality.
Sure. Yeah, and when you achieve that level of stardom and success that he had at his peak, you definitely, that fuels your feeling of invincibility, I think. There's a picture of him that we showed on the screen here of Pete at the 1978 spring training. That's a guy full of a whole lot of self-confidence, as well as a pretty awesome bull haircut. But that's a dude that believes he is infallible, I think. And yeah, you're right. He maybe he liked the risk too. Maybe he liked the the thrill of the danger of gambling on his own team.
Well, and I think that invincibility that you mentioned, while part of him from the beginning, was also inflated by the sports media. One thing that changed in the time, many things changed when the time that Pete was in baseball. He comes up as a minor leaguer in 1960. He's banned from baseball in 1989. 3 decades, 30 seasons of professional baseball. A lot of things changed. But one thing that does change is how the media covers baseball and covers sports in general. In the first 15, 20 years that he was a player, this was the time of the cozy beat writer. The beat writer who traveled with the team, often caroused and went out drinking and womanizing with the team and with the players. They were pals, they were buddies, and they often protected the players. And that certainly happened to a lot of athletes during this era. It also happened to Pete. But the other thing that was different with Pete is, he was white, working class. And that working class element was real for Pete. Coming from a hardscrabble neighborhood on the west side of Cincinnati. And that reminded the beat writers a lot of themselves. Women were not allowed, female reporters were not allowed in major league clubhouses until 1979. 1979. Pete's already been in the league for 16 years. This was really an old boys club, and almost all of the reporters were white and working class, just like Pete. And they loved him because he really reminded them of themselves and what was possible for themselves. And so the invincibility is real for Pete, but it's really also inflated by a sports press that loves him and in a great many ways protects him until they don't ultimately.
Right. And when the turn happened, it turned bad for Pete. So things went really wrong. And that cozy relationship you're talking about between the sports writers and the athletes, that wasn't just in sports. John F. Kennedy had a pretty cozy relationship with the White House reporters who kind of covered up his philandering for many years. So that was not just within the sports media. I think it was throughout the media in general back in the day.
Absolutely right. It was just a different time.
Yeah.
And but by the 1980s, when Pete starts to get in trouble for real this time, that media landscape has changed. ESPN is now one of the biggest networks in America. CNN is now one of the biggest networks in America. Sports Illustrated, the Bible of sports in those days, now has an entire team of investigative reporters. Their only job is to investigate scandals, to dig up stories in that vein. And just, the whole landscape has changed. The world has changed, but Pete has not. He's still the same person he was really ultimately in 1963. He still believes he can do anything and everything, and he's going to go down because of it.
If you're just tuning in, my guest today is Keith O'Brien, the author of Charlie Hustle, a new biography of baseball great Pete Rose. There's a scene toward the end of the book where you're having an interview. You're interviewing Pete in a diner in Las Vegas, and a woman comes up to him, and is a woman in her 60s, and is very flirtatious. And you talk about other people coming up, and one woman had tears in her eyes to meet him. So he still very much has that power of celebrity, even though he's been banished for all these years.
Yeah, let's be clear. Pete has made a great many mistakes in his life. And he's made them, as a grown man, and often not apologized for them or reckoned with them. That said, like a lot of famous people, athletes, politicians, actors, he has a certain charisma about him. And I felt it even, in his presence. And certainly the people who have been in his inner circle and maybe lost access to that inner circle over the years have felt it too. The best way I can describe it is he's almost like a sun, in a universe that he's sort of built out of his own hands. And the planets that are orbiting him, that are still in that sunshine, they want it. They want more of it. They feel it. And the planets, in the outer rings of this solar system, who have, maybe are no longer, close enough to the sun to feel that warmth and appreciation anymore are sort of broken as a result, and really are still trying to figure out what they lost. And that was real in person. I mean, again, like you, Keith, we've had, the privilege of meeting and interviewing lots of prominent figures.
Sure.
And I have never, in all of my years as a journalist, been in the presence of a famous person who has brought people to tears spontaneously in a Beatles-esque kind of way. And I saw that with Pete not once. I saw it multiple times. And at one point I finally asked him, I'm like, we were in that diner in Las Vegas, and an older man had been sort of eyeing Pete from a booth in the corner for a while. And as he got up to leave, he stopped by to just say hello. He didn't want an autograph. He didn't have a baseball. He wasn't looking for anything. He just wanted to say hello. He wanted to tell him that he recognized him. He wanted to tell him what Pete meant to him. And as he started to speak, he absolutely crumbled and absolutely broke down. And he walks away after gathering himself and having a conversation with Pete. And I asked Pete, what is that? What is that? Can you explain that to me? And Pete's not prone to self-reflection as a person, which is a challenge as an interviewer.
Yeah.
But he told me something that I think was absolutely right. He said, I think I remind people of their fathers. And I think I remind people of their childhoods and of being at games with their fathers. And I think I just remind them of all of that. And again, Pete's not prone to deep thoughts like that, and yet I think that is true.
The sections of the book, Charlie Hustle, you've got rise, shine, fame, fall, and wreckage. There is no last redemption chapter. Do you think there's a possibility that at some point Pete somehow redeems himself?
It's a great question, and it's a question that people have been asking since 1989 when he was banned from baseball for life. Pete has certainly sought that redemption. He has tried. He's written, as I said, a couple of memoirs in the last 35 years, through ghostwriters that at first lied about his gambling and then admitted his gambling. And he sort of thought when he wrote that second memoir that ultimately admitted the thing he should have admitted at the start, that yes, he had bet on baseball, and yes, he had bet on the Reds, and yes, he had a gambling problem. He thought when he wrote that memoir in 2004, 20 years ago, that it would win him that redemption, and it didn't. No. Pete, in some ways, is his own worst enemy. He cannot fully embrace, that time in his life and fully reckon with it in the way that we want him to, or the media wants him to. America loves a comeback story, but we love it when that person goes on Oprah Winfrey or goes on Let's Talk with Keith Spera and breaks down and cries and bears their soul to the world. And if we're waiting for Pete to do that, if that's what it takes to get the redemption that you mentioned, then no, he's not going to get it because he simply cannot do that. He's just not wired that way. Right or wrong, he will not go on anyone's show or sit with me at a diner in Las Vegas and weep about the past. It's just not who he is.
No, and we've just got a couple minutes left here, but yeah, he even mentions in the book that his banishment has probably cost him $100 million in employment and sponsorships and all that. So he's aware that he's paid a huge cost. But like you said, he pushes on. He just keeps on trucking. He's not going to worry about it.
I think at this point, with Pete almost 83 years old, the time for redemption is possibly past. He burned so many bridges over the years with his lies about what he had done, that he made enemies of important people and important people at Major League Baseball. And so, I think ultimately we will be reckoning with the wreckage of this story until the end of his life. and we'll see what happens after that. If anyone's been to Cooperstown for the Hall of Fame inductions, it's a massive ceremony these days. 100,000 people, huge crowds. They're not going to celebrate someone like Pete Rose in front of that kind of crowd, and so maybe the time will have to come after he's gone.
And again, just a couple minutes here, but I'll be curious to see what his reaction to the book is, if he has one at all. I mean, who knows? He may not even bother to read it.
I'll be curious as well, Keith. I don't know how he'll react. I don't know how anyone will react. And, I think that's something I've learned as a journalist, and you probably have too over the years. Sometimes you write something, you think people will love it, you think it's positive, and they don't like it. Sometimes you write something, you think it's negative, you think they're going to call you and be angry, and they like it. You just don't know. But I'm really proud of the story. I'm really proud of the narrative. And I think no matter where a reader falls on Pete Rose, whether you love him or hate him, whether you grew up watching him or you never saw him play baseball, I think this is a compelling story that folks will enjoy. Absolutely.
It really is. And I think it took a journalist with your skills to delve in there and make a narrative out of the story and tie all the different threads together and be really honest about it. So congratulations on the book, Charlie Hustle. It's a great read, a great American story, an American tragedy that doesn't have a happy ending necessarily, but it's a great story nonetheless. So congratulations on it.
Thanks so much, Keith. It was always good to visit with you and look at myself in the mirror and think about what I'll look like when I'm 5 years older. You are 5 years older than me, right?
I don't know. Do we have to disclose that? Maybe something like that. Yes, maybe about that. Well, as the book says, I will get my hustle on and try to get another book out before we talk again. So catch up with you.
Thanks so much, Keith. I appreciate it.
You bet. Once again, thanks to everyone for tuning in. I'm Keith Spera. This has been Let's Talk. We'll see you again next week.
Let's Talk with Keith Spera is underwritten by the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation.